When the first mass-market video games were made, they were pretty simple kids' fare. From Pong to Asteroids to Centipede, these games were accessible to anybody and didn't spark any emotions other than the thrill of the high score. But through the 1980s, as games got more complex, they started to get more involved with story. Titles like Final Fantasy started to push the boundaries of what could be done with characters and what developers could expect from the audience. So it was that in 1989, up-and-coming developer Capcom decided that they'd take a little used genre and do something special with it. And while 1972's Haunted House had described itself as a horror survival game, it was Capcom's Sweet Home that many considered to be the first true horror title in gaming history. From there, Capcom would go on to dominate the horror market with a number of franchises, the biggest of which is one of the most popular game series ever made. In an industry obsessed with finding new ways to empower players, Capcom would find its greatest success scaring the daylights out of— Holy Sweet Home released for the Famicom, which was what the original Nintendo was called in Japan. It was a movie tie-in for a Japanese horror film of the same name. The game told the terrible tale of 5 photographers who go to an abandoned mansion, only to find that the place is haunted. Each character had different traits and abilities, making for an effectively class and stat-based game. In other words, an RPG. The difference was that there was nothing to bring back fallen members. If a character died, they and their talents were gone forever. Lose too many characters, and the puzzles could never be completed, and you'd be trapped in the mansion forever. This emphasis on mere survival and the constant threat of real death did something that few other games had ever achieved. It scared its audience. While this title would never come to the West, its influence on later games can still be felt to this day. It took a few more years for a true horror game to arrive on Western shores, but in 1992, Infogrames released Alone in the Dark, a title based on the works of H.P. Lovecraft and dubbed as ambient survival horror. Whether or not its makers had played or even heard of Sweet Home, Infogrames took that same philosophy and proved that Western gamers wanted to be scared too. So, Capcom knew it could do a horror game, and now it knew that there was a worldwide audience for it. But there were only a handful of horror titles available on the market. If they could make a first-rate, grade-A horror game that really scared the pants off of gamers, they could become the kings of a new genre. The only thing left to do was make the game. The responsibility fell to a small-time game director, Shinji Mikami. Mikami had worked for Capcom for a few years making Disney games for Japanese audiences. Somehow, even though he had only made kids' games, Capcom thought he had what it took to make an adult horror title. Mikami jumped at the opportunity and immediately turned to one of his personal favorite games, Capcom's own Sweet Home. Mikami took a lot of Sweet Home's basic tenets to heart, including the secluded mansion and the emphasis on surviving as opposed to defeating. He even took the loading screen. As would become the standard practice for Mikami, he changed the focus of the game several times during development. Originally, they actually thought about making the game a first-person shooter. This in itself would have been a stunning move, since barely a handful of first-person shooters have ever come out of a Japanese studio. However, this was not to be, since the crew decided that a third-person perspective was scarier than a first. The perspective switch also had another advantage. It allowed Mikami to control the camera at every point in the game. He could therefore make creeping around a corner as terrifying as possible, since there was no way to see what was on the other side unless Mikami's camera let you. This in turn led to one of the game's best features, pre-rendered backgrounds. Since the camera's position was known at every point, it was possible to hard-code in all the lighting and detail they wanted from that one and only perspective. As such, very quickly it became clear that their game was going to look a generation beyond anybody else's, whose free cameras meant they couldn't pre-render anything. After a lot of internal debate, they finally settled on a name for their game: Biohazard. However, when Capcom's American division heard the name, they decided it was a little misleading. So the American team picked a different name for the game's US version: It isn't known for sure where they got their name from, but it is a fact that in Sweet Home, the haunted mansion is called the House of Residing Evil. Whether in reference to this or not, the game was called Resident Evil. But oddly enough, the Japanese box ended up having an unintended impact on the Western gaming world. Right on the cover, the Japanese version said, in English, survival horror. Despite all the previous horror games, it was Capcom's latest that would name the entire genre. The game released in March 1996 in both Japan and North America, and was instantly met with fawning praise. It dared to underpower its gamers into a feeling of total helplessness amidst a perfectly creepy haunted mansion filled to the brim with hideous monsters. Puzzles and brain twisters broke up the tension to produce a finely paced experience. Where other game characters were bristling with guns, the two playable characters in Resident Evil had limited ammunition, and worse, could only hold a few items at a time. The male character could hold more items, while the female character wasn't attacked by zombies as often, a bit of gender stereotyping that Capcom took some flack for. However, each character also went on a slightly different adventure, which gave players a reason to go through the mansion a second time. Most challenging of all, game saves were actually collectible items, like ammunition. This meant that if he wasn't careful, the player could run out of save points entirely, in which case he'd have to beat the whole game from the last save in one sitting. While some people loved the added difficulty, others hated it. One thing was for sure, the acting was awful. Really awful.
Oh, chill. This house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
Are you tired, Rebecca?
Sorry, Chris. I am.
You did a really good job. This case was just too weird. This case was...
Capcom had decided to shoot the cutscenes locally and thus grabbed whatever American actors happened to be living in Japan at the time. The result was, well, horrific in its own way. Some of the scenes were actually censored for the US version, cutting scenes of gory corpses and, worst of all, a cigarette. But frankly, less was probably more in this case. None of this was enough to stop the game's momentum. Not nearly enough. The game sold 2.75 million units worldwide, an unqualified smash. Originally exclusive to the PlayStation 1, it was ported to various other consoles to complete the domination. It was official. People were scared, and they loved it. The only question was, how do you scare someone twice? Shinji Mikami, the director of Resident Evil, switched gears and became producer on the sequel. He knew he had a tough job ahead of him since the audience would know what to expect now. So he made the bold choice of leaving his old characters behind and coming up with a new cast. After all, if you have a hero who's already survived a zombie attack, how scared could they be a second time? With the change in cast came the opportunity to shake up everything else. As opposed to the secluded mansion, Mikami wanted to bring fear to the real world. The setting was thus changed to a more urban environment with the hope of making even the safe and familiar setting of a city terrifying. Gameplay would undergo a shift too. One of the first Resident Evil's few drawbacks had been its clunky control scheme, which made combat next to impossible. So Mikami wanted to tighten up the controls a bit and make a more action-oriented game. This was tricky. If they empowered the player too much, it wouldn't be scary. To add to the problem, the sequel's director, Hideki Kamiya, didn't particularly like horror that much. He was more of an action director. Convincing him to make his characters underpowered and helpless was going to be tricky. The crew was juggling a lot of competing ideas and philosophies, and in the end, it proved to be too much. Mikami took a hard look at the game in February 1997, just 2 months before it was supposed to release. There were a lot of good ideas, but they just didn't cohere into a game that Mikami was proud of. So he went to his higher-ups at Capcom and asked the impossible. He wanted to start over. The game was practically finished. They'd already released boatloads of screenshots, fans were clamoring for the sequel, money and time had been spent, and he wanted to start over. But Capcom did the unthinkable. They agreed. Against all business logic, Capcom just put their faith in Mikami. He'd made them one huge success, they just trusted that he could do it again. Mikami got back to work and the team started nearly from scratch. Fans, already rabid, went into a frenzy when they learned they'd have to wait a whole nother year before they could reside with more evil. When Resident Evil 2 finally released in January 1998, it had gigantic expectations to live up to. Fortunately, even after all this time, it blew players away. The new small-town America setting was a perfect fit with the game's creepy tone. Everything was more interactive, from the pre-rendered backgrounds to the character choices. Each character went on a different journey, and on the gamer's second playthrough, he'd find that things he'd done in the first playthrough actually affected his second. All of this was wrapped up in better graphics and smoother animations. But at the end of the day, what Resident Evil 2 absolutely nailed was the atmosphere. Fans ate it up, and the game's buzz was so good that there were quite a few new converts to the franchise. It was once again exclusive to the PS1 initially, though it was later ported to various other consoles. Resident Evil 2 went on to sell 5 million units worldwide, nearly double what the first game had sold, and the first game had been a smash. It was one of the biggest hits in Capcom's entire history. Their gamble to scrap the game completely and start over from square one had paid off. Big time. After his successful stint as producer, it was time for Mikami to head back into the director's chair. The survival horror genre that Capcom had named was proving to be a massive success, and yet only a handful of competing titles were in the market. They realized that they had the opportunity to start a whole new horror franchise without oversaturating the genre. So Mikami got to work on making a brand new series. Perhaps it isn't surprising that the end result didn't look too different from Resident Evil, fixed cameras and all. But there was one major difference. What's scarier than zombies? Dinosaurs, that's what. Dino Crisis released for the PS1 in July 1999 and went on to sell 2.4 million copies. Another smash hit and further proof that Shinji Mikami was made out of solid gold. Capcom's horror division seemed to be on top of the world. So confident were they in their series that after Resident Evil 2, they began work on not one, but 3 new games in the franchise. But complications from both the business and the creative side would end up causing havoc on all 3 of them. Resident Evil 1 and 2 had both released for the PlayStation 1 initially, and were only later ported to other platforms. But with the release of the first 6th generation console, the Sega Dreamcast, Capcom decided to take advantage of the newer, more powerful hardware, and move the main franchise to that system. In the meantime, Capcom wanted to keep its PlayStation fans happy, and got to work on a spin-off title specifically for them. And of course, everyone knew the monster PlayStation 2 was coming, and Capcom got its core Resident Evil team working on that game, which would be part of the main series. However, well after these games were underway, Sony came to Capcom with a proposal. Sony knew that Resident Evil sold PlayStations. As such, they didn't want the main series to go off to rival Sega. Sony negotiated to keep the main series exclusive, at least for a limited time, to their console. Capcom could still make spin-offs for their competitors, but anything with a number in it would come to the PlayStation. Capcom executives agreed to the terms of the deal. There was only one small problem. Resident Evil 3 for the Dreamcast was almost done, as was the spin-off for the PlayStation, a direct violation of their new Sony deal. It was a classic case of the left hand not talking to the right. But being business executives, they came up with a solution that was both quick and cheap. if creatively wonky, just switch the titles. Thus, despite all the marketing that had been done to date, despite how the writing team had crafted them, despite the fact that it didn't necessarily make any sense, the PlayStation game became Resident Evil 3, and the Dreamcast game became the spin-off. Dodge that bullet. The newly reminted Resident Evil 3 Nemesis released in September 1999 for, of course, the PlayStation. The game starred Jill Valentine from the original Resident Evil in her attempt to escape Raccoon City. This was the first time in the series that there was only one playable character, which allowed the designers more time to work on each individual level. It took place both before and after the events of Resident Evil 2, showing its origins as a spin-off title meant to expand on an earlier title rather than standing as a brand new story. Nevertheless, its inclusion of the iconic Nemesis monster, a super creature that chased the player through the entire game, helped drive it to strong reviews and audience acceptance. If Capcom feared a backlash from its name swapping, it never materialized. Resident Evil 3 would go on to sell 3.5 million units, another smash hit for the franchise, and for Sony too. But the original Resident Evil 3 was on its way as well. Now named Resident Evil Code Veronica, the really a sequel but we're calling it a spin-off, released for the Sega Dreamcast in February 2000. This was the first Resident Evil not made by an internal Capcom team. Rather, this was the work of Nextech, a Sega-owned developer. Making full use of Sega's new next-gen hardware, Code Veronica would be the first game in the series to be truly 3D, not just pre-rendered to look pretty. Critics and fans alike agreed that Nextech took the fear factor to the next level, creating the scariest title to date in the father of all horror games. But there was a nagging complaint, and it was starting to become a problem. The actual gameplay was practically unchanged from the first Resident Evil. Fixed cameras, limited inventory, long loading screens, and worst of all, clunky controls all returned. Franchise fans still loved it, but at the same time, more and more people were drifting away. The series needed some kind of change, and soon. So all eyes turned to the one last game in development, the PlayStation 2 game, Resident Evil 4. The crew working on it was the core Resident Evil crew. Franchise creator Shinji Mikami was producing, and Resident Evil 2 director Hideki Kamiya was directing again. But the tension between Mikami's vision and Kamiya's style, which had been an issue on RE2, was worse this time around. Mikami had made a horror game, and horror is all about helplessness. But Kamiya was an action director who liked superpowered heroes who would lay waste to their foes in style. As Mikami looked on, Kamiya made a game that was practically unrecognizable from Resident Evil. Vibrant colors, stylish moves, and an unstoppable protagonist did not a horror game make. But there was one other thing. It was good. Mikami didn't want to stop Kamiya because he sensed that he was onto something massive. So he begged, he pleaded, and finally he convinced the Capcom hierarchy to change the game to something else. Thus, Resident Evil 4 died to be reborn as Devil May Cry. As thoroughbred an action title as could possibly be imagined, DMC's hero Dante was about as helpless as Arnold Schwarzenegger in a tank, but with better moves. It was a stunning game that, when it released in fall 2001, brilliantly showcased the PlayStation 2's power, and at the same time, showed the world how to make an action game in 3 dimensions. Devil May Cry went on to become one of Capcom's best-selling and most iconic series. So Resident Evil wasn't just a hit franchise, it could accidentally make other hit franchises in the meantime. However, that still left Capcom without a new Resident Evil. And after the business and creative chaos that rocked the franchise, new deals and new directions would drive the series to its very peak. While wildly successful, Japanese juggernaut Nintendo was starting to gain a reputation as the kiddie company. They had their Mario and they had their Zelda, but the rest of the market was starting to focus on more mature content. Recognizing that they needed to branch out a little, they came to Capcom and asked if they could have their Undead. So in January 2000, the studio announced that they were making a franchise prequel called Resident Evil Zero for the Nintendo 64. they said that the game would be out by the end of the year. But it wouldn't be a Resident Evil game if it actually finished the way it was supposed to. Sure enough, in September, Capcom held a surprise press conference. Not only would Resident Evil 0 be scrapped and rebuilt from the ground up for Nintendo's new GameCube console, but Resident Evil was going to become a GameCube exclusive franchise. That's right, Sony's deal to keep the main franchise on their system had only lasted one game. From now on, Capcom would be taking the Kitty Company's new machine and scaring the pants off of it. And if all that wasn't enough, the father of the series, Shinji Mikami, announced that he would be returning to the director's chair to make a new game, or rather, an old game. He would be making Resident Evil, the game that started it all. Again, but for the GameCube. It was a blow for Sony, who had thought they'd locked the franchise to their platform. Still, Sony was an enormous multimedia giant, and it had more going for it than just the PlayStation. In March 2002, Sony Pictures, through its Screen Gems subsidiary, released Resident Evil. Made relatively cheaply by B-movie director Paul W.S. Anderson and starring Milla Jovovich, it went on to do fairly good business. It ended up spawning a franchise, one of the few in which each successive movie did better than the last. Despite the reputation that game-to-film adaptations aren't any good, Resident Evil movies are among the few to have turned a profit. And only a month later, Resident Evil released for the GameCube. No, this wasn't a movie tie-in, this was the Mikami-directed remake of the original game. However, while it kept the same characters, plot, and setting, it was otherwise largely reworked with different rooms and puzzles. Old fans would be getting a new experience. But that said, it went back to some of the old conventions, including fixed cameras, clunky controls, and pre-rendered backgrounds. Back in 1996, pre-rendered backgrounds made the game look a generation ahead of its time. It would be no different in 2002, and many critics cited the game as one of the best looking on any system. More importantly than the actual look was the atmosphere. And if there was one thing Mikami was good at, it was atmosphere. Despite being a remake, it was praised as being one of the scariest games ever made. With tons of replay value, including 10 possible endings, 2002's Resident Evil was a success for Capcom and proof that a Nintendo console could go mature. But a movie and a game in one year wasn't enough. In November came Resident Evil 0, the prequel originally meant for the Nintendo 64, now on the GameCube. As a prequel, 0 set up the events of the original title. In other words, Capcom released a remake of the first game before releasing a prequel to the first game. Regardless, like its predecessor, or successor, or whatever, Resident Evil 0 was praised for nailing down its terrifying atmosphere. But all that being said, there was a complaint. It was the same complaint as on the last game, and the game before that, and the one before that. Resident Evil wasn't evolving. Fixed cameras, clunky controls, despite different characters and settings, it was the same old game. And while the fan base was still loyal, they were getting fewer and fewer new gamers to try it. Still in all, the game sold 1.25 million copies, proving that even if the franchise was getting as stale as its zombies, it still had as much life left in it as its zombies. But Capcom knew enough was enough, and tried to invent a new formula. They had already attempted to introduce light gun mechanics into the series with Resident Evil Survivor and Resident Evil Dead Aim, but these games were dismissed by critics and gamers alike. In December 2003 in Japan and March 2004 in North America, Resident Evil Outbreak broke out on the PS2. This would be a dramatic shift in structure. It would not feature one hero alone, but 8 different ordinary citizens, each with their own unique weapons and abilities. It would not be one long experience, but consist of 5 different scenarios that were basically unrelated. It would not be played alone, but with a total of 4 characters, whether they be other players online or bots offline. And it would not feature any real plot, instead letting the different character interactions drive the story in each scenario. Sadly, most reviewers claim that the good idea was undercooked. The controls were still wonky, and there was no good way to communicate with other players. Voice chat was not supported. Nobody thought that it was a bad game per se, but there was nothing to really make it stand out. The game did not sell well and was largely ignored. Then again, as a zombie horror game with 4-player online co-op in several small scenarios, its influence clearly lived on as an early precursor to Valve's Left 4 Dead series. Resident Evil was a massive series reaching its end. But Capcom didn't want their cash cow put out to pasture. It needed a massive overhaul. It needed to adapt to its time without selling out or becoming derivative. They needed the one man who had always struck gold with the franchise he'd started in the first place. They needed Shinji Mikami. He gave them a horror title so good, it is still considered one of the best games of any kind ever made. Mikami was originally brought on to be the producer of Resident Evil 4, with the director's chair going to the man behind RE2, Hideki Kamiya. But famously, Kamiya's action sensibilities could not be constrained, and the result was a brand new game, Devil May Cry. So Mikami had produced a great game. It just wasn't a Resident Evil game. For his next attempt, Mikami went for a different director with a different direction. Hiroshi Shibata had worked on previous games in the series. Now it was his turn to run the show. Perhaps in reaction to Kamiya's action-heavy approach, Shibata went for a much stealthier experience. This version would deal with the RE2 hero Leon Kennedy and the evil Umbrella Corporation, the bad guys behind the whole series. Leon's supernatural foe would be an insidious black fog that haunted the player. But after months of work, Mikami took a hard look at the game and, again, concluded it just wasn't Resident Evil. And unlike Devil May Cry, this version didn't deserve its own franchise. It was quietly scrapped, and Mikami and Shibata began again. This time, they went insane. Literally. The idea of the new version would be that Leon gets infected with a horrible virus that makes him go crazy, seeing things that aren't really there. This would be a more psychological kind of scare, which actually went against Mikami's nature. He preferred more visceral, tangible threats, which was why he had gone for zombies back in the original game. Nonetheless, when Mikami unveiled the first footage of the game at E3 2003, he famously warned the audience, "Don't pee your pants." But despite the good reaction, it didn't take long for him to take another hard look at the game and decide, once again, that he didn't like the direction it was going in, and scrap it. So now, they were in a bind. They needed a new game, but nothing they tried seemed to work. They tried going back to their roots, making a fixed-camera zombie game, but it was so formulaic that they realized it would just have all the same old problems. At last, Shibata stepped down as director. There was only one man who could replace him, Shinji Mikami. It was time for the master to remind the world why he was the master. Mikami had defined the horror genre once. Now he was going to redefine it. In this new version of Resident Evil 4, gone would be the fixed cameras. Instead, the camera would stay behind Leon. Gone would be the infamously clunky combat. This would be a first-rate third-person shooter in which you could target specific body parts. Gone would be the slow, stupid, meandering zombies. Now Leon would face intelligent enemies that could communicate and organize. Gone would be the perennial night, and for the first time, the series would see the light of day, although through a lot of fog. In other words, Gone would be everything that made Resident Evil, Resident Evil. There was plenty to be nervous about. They might have gotten stale, but the old conventions had produced one of the most beloved and best-selling franchises in the industry. The new combat mechanics skewed the game towards action, which in turn might make the game less scary. And on top of all that, the seemingly endless development cycle of broken promises had left a bad taste in gamers' mouths. Could they ever forgive Capcom and give Resident Evil 4 a chance? The answer was yes. When Resident Evil 4 at long last released in January 2005, it was instantly and universally hailed as a masterpiece. Despite the action-oriented focus, Leon's numerous and intelligent enemies ended up being far more terrifying than stumbling zombies ever were. And as they started getting bigger, the intensity turned up to 11. It even made you play as a character with no weapons at all. Now that's scary. The vast differences from Evil's yore weren't condemned. Rather, they were praised for reinvigorating the franchise. The new camera system especially was a desperately needed breath of fresh air and allowed for the best control scheme the series had ever had. And most astoundingly, the voice acting didn't suck, which made it easier to empathize with the characters, which made the scary bits even more terrifying. With all that good buzz, it sold like crazy. The original GameCube exclusives sold a solid 1.6 million units. The later port to the PlayStation 2, with its much larger install base, sold a further 2.2 million. And the eventual Wii version sold another 1.7 million. Mikami and Capcom had done it. They'd saved the series from itself. Still, they'd done it at the expense of their beloved, slow, stupid, shambling, mindless, innumerable, endless zombies. So if they couldn't be in Resident Evil anymore, Capcom was just going to have to reintroduce them to their natural habitat, the shopping mall. In July 2005, only a few months after Resident Evil 4 dropped, Capcom announced Resident Evil 5. They had a trailer to show off and a couple of news bombs. For one thing, horror would be coming to the new kids on the block, the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. For another, the trailer showcased broad daylight in a series famous for its spooky atmosphere. Also of note was that Mikami would not be involved with this title. Rather, this game would be under the leadership of producer Jun Takeuchi. What wasn't announced was a release date. While fans were hoping for a quick turnaround, this was Resident Evil, which had a history of long development cycles. And RE5 would be no different. 2006 came and went with no more evil. But it did give fans something. Taking horror back to the foundations that George Romero laid in the 70s, Capcom unleashed Dead Rising for the Xbox 360 in 2006. It featured a shopping mall, you, and zombies.
Zombies, huh?
Lots of zombies. Despite a trend in the 2000s to show zombies as fast and agile, these endless hordes would be as slow and mindless as, well, zombies. The key selling point was that the player's character could slaughter zombies in whatever way he could imagine. Every object and every item in the game could be picked up and weaponized. For that matter, pretty much anything could be worn by the player too. The result, while incredibly gory, leaned more towards comedy than anything else. That being said, it did have one mechanic that ramped up the difficulty curve. The entire game had a countdown timer. On top of that, the missions were time sensitive, which meant that if you weren't at the right place at the right time, you lost the game. It was an innovative challenge to be sure, but it was made more a fault by the fact that players were only allowed one save. This meant that if a gamer saved a game at a place that made it impossible to reach the next mission in time, he'd have to start the entire game over. Most of these issues were later fixed in the February 2009 port for the Wii called Chop Till You Drop. It not only allowed the player multiple saves, but also made each mission have its own timer as opposed to one overarching timer for the entire game. Despite these genuine improvements, it had one fatal flaw. The Wii's weaker system specs meant that there weren't that many zombies on screen at once, which was the entire point of playing the game. In early 2007, disaster struck. Capcom had set up a new department in 2004 called Clover Studio, in which they had gathered some of their best talent, including Shinji Mikami and Devil May Cry creator Hideki Kamiya. But in late 2006, Capcom had determined that this new studio wasn't profitable and shut it down. They had expected everyone to come back to other internal Capcom branches, but instead, the Clover crew decided to leave and form their own new startup, first called Seeds and later Platinum Games. Capcom had lost Mikami, the man who had not only invented Resident Evil, but had always managed to breathe fresh air into the series whenever it got stale. But the publisher wasn't about to stop making Resident Evil 5. And sure enough, the game surfaced again at E3 2007. Importantly, the new trailer was shown at Microsoft's press conference. Since the franchise had before only come to Nintendo and Sony, this was a big win for the Big M. At the conference, the producer Jun Takeuchi promised a 2008 release. But having learned from previous experience, most people thought the date might get pushed. And they were right. Resident Evil 5 released in March 2009 for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, nearly 4 years after its original announcement. And when people sat down to play it, they were in for a bit of a surprise. Taking the RE4 approach to its logical extreme, RE5 had such an action focus that many critics stated it really wasn't survival horror anymore. The slow-paced, creeping dread had largely been replaced by constant combat. And so intense was that combat that only by having a second player could you make it through. As such, this game was designed from the ground up for co-op. If a gamer wanted to play single player, the second character would be taken over by the AI. With such intense changes to the tone and style of the game, would audiences still flock to the old cash cow? Or would it drive them away? 5.4 million copies later, the answer was that yes, they would still like to play. It stands as one of the most successful single titles Capcom has ever released. To date, the entire franchise has sold 44 million copies, making it one of the largest in gaming history and the high point of Capcom's catalog. It came as a surprise to absolutely no one when Capcom announced that Resident Evil 6 was in the works. No release date has been given. In the meantime, Capcom came to a Western studio and asked them to rise the dead again. Dead Rising 2 for the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and PC released in September 2010 from Blue Castle Games. Despite the change in developer, the game was largely similar to the first, except that it was in a casino instead of a shopping mall. It also decided that the first game wasn't ridiculous enough, so they let players combine multiple items into even more implausible weapons. Amazingly, the game was a success before it even released. In August, Capcom released a downloadable game called Case Zero, which acted as both a prologue and a demo to the main game. At the low price of only $5, Capcom stated it had the best Week 1 sales of any Xbox Live Arcade game in history. A second DLC called Case West is under development now. All in all, it made Dead Rising 2 a massive success. So massive that in the same month, Capcom announced that it was going to acquire Blue Castle outright and rebrand it Capcom Game Studios Vancouver. Expect more zombies shuffling to a console near you soon. Capcom is a mighty name in the world of gaming, with several franchises that are legendary in the industry. And yet their most successful genre is the one that makes players feel at their weakest, their most helpless, and their most terrified. The little-used horror genre was brought into the mainstream by the publisher's single most successful franchise, and has been supported across the years by other series and spin-off titles. But without the guiding vision of the man who started it all in the first place, Capcom will now have to fill the void left by the titan of the genre. It's a scary time for Capcom, but then again, that's the entire point.